As you will have noticed from the last 3 days, it is very difficult to get the Western delegates to turn up on time to anything we are running. So I'm going to start the panel with the doors open in the hope that people will file in and not miss what promises to be an excellent panel of very interesting papers on gender in translation. And we have 3 speakers today, Yuri Suzuki from Tokyo Institute of Technology, Moe Sakai from the University of Sacred Heart, and Maria Honda from Nozugaki University. And I'm going to spend as little time as possible talking and giving them as much time as possible, and for everybody else to ask questions. So without further ado, let me introduce Yuri Suzuki, who is a second-year doctoral degree program student at School of Environment and Society of Tokyo Institute of Technology. She received a bachelor's degree in anthropology, majoring in anthropology and minoring in English, from St. Mary's University, and she received a master's degree from the Tokyo Institute of Technology. She's recently studied the representation of boys in early modern England and has attended the 59th Shakespeare Conference held by the Shakespeare Society of Japan, and she's published a review article. Please join me in welcoming Yuri Suzuki.
Thank you, Jessica-san, for the introduction, and thank you for the Committee of Funding Translation for this great opportunity. My name is Yuri Suzuki, and I am a PhD student at Tokyo Institute of Technology. Although the title says Depriving Lady Macbeth's Power and Masculinity, I will also discuss how power and masculinity that are only available to readers in Japan. And in the second half, I will talk about how she is described in social media in Japan. And in the second half, I will discuss the vocative and gendered words that function to recreate the image of her and her relationships with the other characters. And among many of the published translations of Macbeth, I will focus on the recent ones. And this is just a diagram of the main characters. And now I would like to show some examples of how Lady Macbeth is introduced to Japanese readers and playgoers today. Many of the synopses of the translated texts describe her as an ambitious and manipulative character. And the bottom one, this bottom one is actually not from the books, but from Wikipedia, but this is very insightful. While Macbeth's description is very simple, merely stating the changes in his social statuses, Lady Macbeth's description is full of character, ambitious, vicious, and even charismatic. Compared to her, Macbeth looks very ordinary, even boring. And the second slide shows 2 descriptions of Japanese theatrical adaptations of Macbeth. Especially the left one from Ninagawa Macbeth is very unique, as it explains both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth as the protagonists of the story, putting that it is not only Macbeth nor Lady Macbeth alone who commits a series of crimes, but the 2 together commit homicide, climb a social ladder, and then fall. What we can know from these descriptions is that playwrights, translators, editors, and writers probably do not want to show her as just a queen or wife. She is fierce and ambitious, and that makes not only her, but the play itself intriguing. The study on Lady Macbeth has been conducted for some time, and one of them is done by Baruor, who claims that her plots to manipulate Macbeth and challenge his masculinity are her defiance toward a patriarchal system. And when you think of masculinity in a patriarchal society of early modern England, it includes having free access to both public and private spheres and to be exposed to or at the public. And in this context, public includes not only but limited to politics, academics, jurisdiction and legislation, theater, economics, and warfare. Dominated by adult men and adult women, boys and girls, if not always, often stayed out of this public sphere. And this leads to the question, are there any elements appearing in Japanese translated texts that keep Lady Macbeth in a private sphere, or in the opposite way, get her out of this private chamber, pushing her towards to the public, and in a patriarchal society? And the very first quote I must introduce is this. When the two conspire to murder Duncan, Macbeth worries, if we should fail, and Lady Macbeth says, if we fail? One of many troubling yet interesting problems of Japanese is that we do not clarify the subject of the action. So in Tsubochi's version, the couple says, didn't mention who fails. And in this point, I'd like to quote Matsuoka Kazuko's afterword. Until she started working on the translation, she had assumed that it was only Macbeth who fails. But there is a huge gap between I fail, you fail, and we fail. As Matsuoka writes, the translation must be done in a way that Japanese readers and future playgoers know that it takes the two to plot the murder. Otherwise, a complicity between the two would be blurred. So she decided to put oretachi, masculine we, and watashitachi at feminine or polite we at the end of each line. Matsuoka writes that this might bend an important rule of Japanese, but this bending of the rule, in fact, functions to outstand the intensity of the scheme that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are about to commit. So the subjective case can change the relationship between the wife and husband and regulate the wife's accessibility to the public phenomenon. When the subject is we, the two are in ally in a politic uprising. But Lady Macbeth stays as a wife who supports her husband in private when the subjective is undefined. If so, there may be other elements that change her presence in public and her masculinity. And the vocative and gendered words may be an answer to the question. But the vocative is another tricky element because it is not a common custom to use the vocative in Japanese. When we look at how Lady Macbeth talks to her husband, she uses my lord for 4 times. And the first and second time are when they are almost alone with the servant. The literal translation of my lord is heika, but instead of using that word, the translators use anata. And this anata means you with a slight formalness. But when a wife uses this word to her husband, it usually functions as a vocative, meaning my husband. The third time is when she calls Macbeth as a newly crowned king, my lord, my royal lord, at the banquet scene. And this time, the translators do not use anata, feminine and private you, but use gozen or heika, which means my lord or your majesty. The fourth time is at the banquet scene as well, and Matsuoka and Ishii decided to translate as heika, while Tsubochi and Kawai translated as private feminine anata. Yet this anata can be fair as well when we say that this conversation takes place after the guests have left. Altogether, we can say that Japanese Lady Macbeth, or Lady Macbeth's plural, seems to be aware of how she and her husband should be exposed to the public. Her conscious choice of words in Japanese outstands the distinction between private and public. When she decides to use my lord instead of my husband, anata, her coming out of the private chamber and presenting herself in private are emphasized, compared to the original English texts that cannot show this difference. On this point, the vocative friends must be discussed as well. When she directly talks to the nobles, she says, sit, worthy friends. And this vocative is dropped off in some of the translations, and in some others, it is translated as minasan or minasama, meaning everyone. The first time she uses this word friends is at the beginning of the banquet scene, where Macbeth introduces her, and her response is, "Pronounce it for me, to all our friends." Tsuboshi decided not to translate "to all our friends," and in Matsuoka and Kawai's translations, she says "minasama ni," meaning to everyone. And Ishii's latest version, she says "goyujin gata ni," literally means to friends. Here we come back to one of the big problems of Japanese language, which is that the subjective and possessive cases are not always obvious. When she says "goyujin gata ni," the possessive our is eliminated. And instead, the honor words go and gata, these articles, which are often used by female characters are added, connotating that these friends are not ours, but yours, the king's friends. This exclusion of herself is repeated later in the play, where she talks to her husband, "Your noble friends do lack you." The question is, why is this notion of friends important? Friendship in early modern England is, quoting Path, signified far more than the voluntary ties we associate with the term today. Among the privileged classes, friendship was a social institution to complement other social bonds, kinship, and marriage. And Alan Bray calls this friendship an ethical practice. One thing we must not forget is that this ethical practice was taking place between men. Friendship was usually a highly homosocial network in early modern England. So, for Lady Macbeth, to call a group of lords composed of adult privileged males is not just an act of calling them. To call them friends shows her struggle and ambition to make an appearance and get involved in public phenomena governed by those people, where women were usually marginalized, excluded, ignored. But again, it is very difficult to translate the word friends or friends in Japanese. Sometimes it is translated in ally or everyone without possessive cases, and sometimes it is simply dropped off. And the last part, my paper discusses gendered words in Lady Macbeth's speech. These are from the Merchant of Venice, so I will skip these. Okamoto generalizes the characteristics of feminine words in Japanese as using more honor words, using more prefix, avoiding the imperative form, and avoiding the affirmative form, which altogether create a soft, indirect, elegant, and graceful atmosphere. I would also like to add modest as well. And Nakamura argues that feminine, polite, soft, and indirect words imply the characteristics of passive, caring, and non-violent. And masculine, clear, assertive, and direct words imply rational, active, and violent characteristics. Japanese have a variety of pronouns to address I, you, and the third person that must be discussed from the gender perspectives. But among these, this paper focuses on the third person plural and sentence ending particles. And this is the very first conversation between Lady Macbeth and her husband. Both translations show, this is from the latest Ishii version, and the left two columns are from 2008 Anzai's version. The both translations show similar choice of words using a respectful suffix kata and put applied prefix o to the nouns. The biggest difference is the very first line of her. Thank you. And yes, and in the latest Ishii's version, she puts 偉大なる or great, glamorous, 立派な or worthy quarter as precise as the original, while 2008 Anzai's version put dono. Dono is an honorific article to a person, and ご領主様. 領主 is lord with honor prefix and suffix. And this means that this Anzai's version's Lady Macbeth shows obvious respect and devotion. Yet when she tries to convince her husband, these two ladies start to show some difference. Okay, this is when she tries to convince her husband, and on the left, Ishi's version, she stays polite. On the other hand, on Anzai's version, she becomes a little bit more persuasive. When the Lady Macbeth in English says must, this Anzai's Lady Macbeth does not use polite article, and for into my dispatch, she uses the imperative particle omakase nasai, which is pretty assertive and masculine. Well, not masculine, but pretty assertive. And having pointed out this slight difference, it is in her soliloquy that we can find apparent differences. After she receives the letters from Macbeth and lets the messengers go, being alone by herself, she begins her solo speech. On the left side, Ishi's Lady Macbeth uses rather soft and modest words, and Anzai's Lady Macbeth is more masculine, assertive, or even aggressive. For example, when she talks to the spirits, to come, the left Ishi's version of Lady Macbeth use oide, which is a soft imperative come. On the other hand, Anzai's Lady Macbeth uses koi, which is pretty masculine come. And these types of different imperative forms are repeated later in the speech as well. So these images of soft, modest Lady Macbeth on the left and assertive, masculine Lady Macbeth on the right continue throughout the speech. For example, when she talks to mothering ministers in Japan is translated minion. And to make this plural, Ishi's version put tachi. Tachi is a neutral suffix to make a pronoun, countable noun, plural. On the other hand, Anzai's version put domo. Domo is also a suffix to make a noun plural, but this is pretty aggressive. And at the last part, when she says, "Nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, hold, hold," Anzai's version says, "Arumai," not pleading or begging compared to Ishi's version, but this Anzai's version, Lady Macbeth, simply yet confidently makes a solid statement that she believes. Anzai's Lady Macbeth, in short, presents herself in several different ways. Confidence, repressive as an unsexed dictator is for one, and polite and modest as a caring wife for two, and slightly ambitious and passive as a potential queen for three. These differences of her self-representation are emphasized by her husband saying, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck." In Anzai's translation, dearest Chuck becomes kawaii yatsu, meaning dear or cute doll, in a very casual and slightly masculine way. And this means that Macbeth never knows her. He has never known Lady Macbeth as a confident, repressive, unsexed dictator, only witnessing her as a caring wife or a potential queen, leading Lady Macbeth to keep her confident identity only to herself. Judith Butler argues that gender identity is constructed through performativity, and I would say that Lady Macbeth in some Japanese texts take advantage of this performativity. She unveils her confidence, violence, masculine at least when she is alone in private, while presenting herself as a polite and caring wife when she is with her husband. I have to note that this does not mean some other translations take her masculinity away from Lady Macbeth. For example, in Ishi's latest translation, both Lady Macbeth and Macbeth speak polite and modest, blurring the dichotomic line between femininity and masculinity, private and public, leading their relationship to a very different equal stage in a very different way. But in conclusion, I would say that what is found in translation is that in Japanese is that some ways of reimagining gender identity and re-emphasizing power and masculinity with the use of gendered words. Thank you.